what happens in 9 out of 10 sales encounters is you either get an advance where the sale moves forward in a little way, or you get a continuation. Okay. That's why you need to prepare a ideal advance, what's the best possible outcome, as well as a couple of alternatives, just in case the ideal advance turns out to be unrealistic for some reason.
This is the Storytelling for Sales podcast, a show about leveraging the power of storytelling to ignite your sales performance and grow your business.
Well, hello and welcome back. I'm your host, executive sales trainer and coach Ed Bilat, and it's great to have you back with us today. Listen, a couple of weeks ago, I got absolutely swamped with questions. How to close Q4, especially now when you don't have access to decision makers and you can't meet with people face to face anymore. And I get it. It's tough. So I think LinkedIn did this study that over 40% of companies experience significant drop in the rates of responsiveness to marketing, to email, to any kind of outreach they were doing before. So I decided to take a break. I took my pedal board, and for the last time, because I'm in Ottawa, Canada, right before it snowed, I drove to a lake. And on the way to the lake, I decided to listen to a podcast. And guess what I found? How to close business in a virtual environment. And the funny thing, the podcast was so good that I actually arrived to the lake and I was still sitting in the car listening to the very end of that podcast. Then I took my phone out and I typed a message to a speaker, James Muir in this case. And I said, James, absolutely loved your podcast. Could you please come to my show? And I left the phone in the car because I didn't want to drop it. Took a pedal board to the lake, and a few hours later, when I came back, there was a message from James. Love to do it. Let's set this up. Isn't that amazing? So here we are with a very special guest and an amazing person, James Muir. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Ed. It's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thrilled to have you with us today. So listen, 2 weeks ago, I actually had a chance to listen to your webinar. It was on how do you sell in a virtual environment, selling in the virtual world. And I was absolutely captivated by your stories, techniques, experiences, and particularly the real application of these techniques in the real world. So that's what got me going. So I felt like I got to get this guy on the show. So
I do try to keep it very practical. Yeah,
absolutely. So particularly kind of like 3 things I took from that webinar. So the perfect close, of course, which is your book, like a 2-step process. Then the 3 magical questions to ask yourself as a sales rep before going into any meeting. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, my favorite is your something special close, which I think is like really, really good. For our time today and for our listeners, what I was hoping we can revisit some of them, depending how discussion goes, right? But before we do that, may I ask you our traditional question, which is, what type of business success story inspires you and why, James?
So probably I have a lot, but probably my favorite is Edwin C. Barnes. If you don't know who that is, Napoleon Hill writes about him in Think and Grow Rich at the very beginning. He ultimately became one of the most successful men in America by partnering with Thomas Edison. What most people don't know is that in 1905, in the middle of the Great Depression, he's looking like a hobo. He actually bums a ride on freight trains all the way to New Jersey in hopes of meeting Thomas Edison. And he did get his meeting with Thomas Edison. And despite looking like a total mess and only 2 nickels in his pocket, he told Edison he was there to partner with him. Not that he wanted a job, but that he was there to partner with them. And other people were there at the meeting, laughed hysterically at this whole thing. But Edison didn't. He saw something different. What he said later is he said he saw a determined person, right, that was willing to do whatever it took to succeed. So impressed with that, he gave him a job as a person who would sweep the plant, right? That's what he gave. And Barnes took him up on it. And even he was not insulted in the least about that. He said that, okay, that's where I'm starting my career. He worked as hard as he could in every chance he got, and recognizing that this was just an opportunity. And that went on for a couple of years. And then just kind of moving forward, Edison invented this thing called a dictating machine. He called it the Ediphone back then. And it could capture and play back the human voice on a wax roll. Anyway, none of his team and sales guys thought it could be sold. They thought it was unsellable, basically. And Barnes picked up on this and said, the opportunity, he says, I'll take the marketing for it and I'll take the installation for this. if you give me an equity share in the business, right? So where nobody else would touch it, he jumped on it. And within months of securing that agreement, Edison and Barnes had sold thousands of these machines. And in fact, he grew so rapidly that Barnes had to create his own company, his own firm, to keep up with the growth in sales. And that ended up creating massive value for Edison himself and all these customers. So obviously, it's an amazing rags to riches type of story. And I think there's a ton of things that you can learn about from it. But what inspires me is that he had nothing. So all the other things he needed to succeed came after his decision about what he wanted, right? He made a decision about what he wanted, and it was the work going in partnership with Edison. And once he had that, everything else came out. It didn't happen overnight. It took years of proving himself to Edison before the opportunity. So there's some importance about due diligence and persistence in there. And then even after the opportunity presented itself, he still had to work hard in order to make the most of that. But again, the whole thing starts with that decision, right? Knowing what you want, and then just deciding that that's what you're going to go for.
Wow. That's a great story. So like I see multiple applications of things you discuss on a regular basis. So the first appointment, first of all, getting the first appointment, right? So like how do you do your first discovery meeting and actually convincing your prospect, Tom Edison in this, right? And then actually proving himself and finding other ways to provide value and eventually creating a separate enterprise as a partner. I certainly see the intention statements built here. So great. Okay, so thank you so much for sharing this. So James, you're an interesting guy. So you're not just a keynote speaker, facilitator, trainer, best-selling author, but you also an acting sales vice president, right? So you're still in the field and not doing it for one company, but actually for two. For Essential Hub and for Marketware, right?
That is correct.
So how do you combine these two things?
Well, very carefully, we'll say. Yeah, I have to be very diligent about my time. Now that my kids have grown up and have moved out of the house, it's a little easier to find time from a family side of things, but it does require a long work. What I do here with you, that's my passion, right? I like writing, I like training. And so I do that. I would say probably 20% of my time is devoted to that. And the rest of it is devoted to actually day-to-day VP work, hiring people, motivating people, setting up operations, things like that.
Wow, that's great, because this is the data from the real world, not some imagination, right? From some guy who used to sell 40 years ago, but now just writes books, right? So it makes it even more valuable. How did you even get into the sales world?
So I'm actually an accidental salesperson. My father owned a chain of revenue cycle management companies. We used to call them billing services back in those days. And we acquired a business in Salt Lake City. They needed someone who could help with operations. And so I moved to Salt Lake City. So I was super excited because I always wanted to manage my own office, and I had some cool ideas, and I thought I could add some innovations. And honestly, it kind of bugged me that where I was currently at, people thought that I was a mediocre guy and I had an easy job because my father was the boss. So deep down, what I really wanted to do is to go to this other office and beat all the other offices and prove that I was a better manager, really. And so part of my strategy was to be very high touch. So I'd actually go out with the sales people on their sales calls to help answer technical questions. So in that sense, I was a subject matter expert. And here's the funny thing, as I was going out in these visits, I used to say and watch what they do. And I'd say, man, to myself, I hope I never have to do that. But how I got drafted into sales is about a year into that, this salesperson who we inherited from the acquisition, he left the company and took about half our clients with him. So really devastating for our business. And after a couple of months, my dad comes to me and says, hey, we need you in sales, or this branch is going to die. People are going to lose their jobs. Clients are going to get orphaned, and a whole lot of money is going to get lost. So I'm like, he said the other salespeople weren't working out. And then he just comes out and says it. So I need you to be sales or we're going to lose everything. No pressure, right? Yeah. So I figure I got to do it. And I thought, if you're going to do it, you may as well go all in. So in sort of, the most macho persona I could muster, I said, all right, I'll do it. I'll make it happen. Right. But inside, I'll be honest with you, I was petrified. I remember going back and all those times that I've been with a salesperson and thinking, man, I'm glad I don't have to do that. And then here I was having to do exactly that. Mm-hmm. So what I told myself at that time is I can learn it, right? I can teach myself to be a salesperson. And I really did want to save my dad's business and keep it from failing, but I felt like I was giving up my chance to be a manager actually when I got into sales. So what I told myself, it was just temporary, and then I'd do this long enough to get things back on track. And ironically, even though I didn't know it, it turns out I'm perfect for sales. It wasn't as smooth. I will tell you, there was kind of rocky in there for a while before I figured out how to actually do things because I didn't have any mentors. So I just read books furiously. A lot of the books that I read had very bad advice, actually, but I didn't know that. So I was testing out all these things in real life. But that is maybe the short version of how I got drafted into sales. But I've now been in sales, and I first served in every role from an executive vice president to all the way down to an individual contributor over the last 30 years. And so it turns out that's the spot that I'm supposed to be in.
Very interesting. So obviously you've done a lot of different roles, so from different angles. So how can we borrow your experience for our listeners? Like with regards to virtual world specifically, is there a particular theme? Is there anything in particular you see in terms of the mistakes salespeople when transitioning from face-to-face to online?
Yeah. Well, there's a number of things. One of the things that's a big deal is that a lot of the high touch that's available in face-to-face communication is compromised when you're in a virtual environment. And that's even assuming that you've got cameras on, because sometimes the client won't even turn their camera on. So you don't get their facial feedback, right? Yeah. And so what that means is there's a lot of things that are affected, but one of the things is your ability to communicate your genuine intent and the trust that you're building with the customer, that's compromised pretty heavily in a virtual environment because they're getting most of that from the sound in your voice. It's called paralanguage. And if you're not one of those people that conveys how you feel in your voice very well, then you're handicapped even further, right? So some things that people need to do just kind of in a general sense is like this. Actually, I'm in my office here, one of my offices, and you can see there's no light on this side. So I got a shadow on my head right now. But some people, even worse, salespeople will have a window behind them. Yeah. Or a light behind them. And then it makes it look like they're in the witness protection program, right? So that's a mistake to make. Probably audio is even more important than video. People will tolerate bad video, but they won't tolerate bad audio. So you got to make sure you have good equipment when you are doing any kind of a virtual selling. And then there's another number of things. But the good news is that virtual selling is a gift. I mean, it is a miracle. I mean, with the virtual selling, you can sell to any person, anytime, anywhere around the world, right? And so in that sense, it's wonderful. I'm not disparaging it at all. We want to use it, but we also need to be aware of the compromises that come with it and then just maximize those. But the very core of it, it's really no different than regular selling. And so that means before any call that you have with a customer, there's 3 questions that you should be asking yourself before you go into any meeting.
Three magical questions.
That's right. These are the 3 magic questions, okay? And the first one is, why should this client see me? Okay. And what that does is that speaks to your value proposition and why they should be meeting with us. And the second question is, what do I want the client to do? What are you hoping is going to happen as a result of this meeting? What do you want the outcome to be? And then the last question is, how can I provide value on this encounter? And here's the good and the bad news about that particular question. The bad news is the customers don't need us as salespeople anymore for information. They can get that off the internet. They don't need it from us. Okay. So unless we're making our sales encounter inherently valuable somehow, customers don't need us, right? And I know that's tough medicine to share with your audience, but the good news is this, is that research proves that if the salesperson identifies an unanticipated solution, a unrecognized problem, or an unseen opportunity, one of those 3 things, that they're actually willing to pay a premium for the solution, right? And so that's what the data shows. So by answering that question, how can I provide value on this encounter? You're literally making your meeting inherently valuable and adding value to both you and the customer. So those 3 questions essentially form the basis of what I call the call objective. And our call objective actually forms the basis of the perfect close questions, which is what you referenced earlier in our meeting here that's written about in the book.
Okay. To summarize, so like these are all excellent points. So basically you're telling us that in the virtual world, the same thing happens as in the face-to-face, and that you should ask the same questions to yourself before getting on that Zoom call, right? Is that correct?
Yep, 100%.
100%. Okay. We just had a training this morning, and the most popular question by far was, okay, how do you get deals closed? How do you ask for business looking on the camera and at the microphone, right? And there's no interaction. How do you do this in virtually? How do you actually close the business? And I know there's a great book, right? So The Perfect Close, best-selling book, brilliant book. But give us the magic. Give us the magic of that famous, I think it's a 2-step close, right? So
Correct.
how does this work?
Let me give them a little confidence before we share what the questions are. There's a company called gong.io. And what gong.io does is they do call analytics. So they take call centers and they just analyze all these calls. And one of the questions that they asked is they said, what is the best closing approach that's out there, right? What's the most successful closing approach? And the one that I'm about to share with your audience is hands down the best closing approach that there is, as proven by scientific research done at gong.io. They analyzed over 1 million calls and learned that hands down, the perfect close is the best closing approach. And the highest performers actually are using it about 3 times per hour.
Oh, wow.
Right? Okay. Which should tell you that it doesn't get old the more that you use it, right? So now that they've got a little confidence, a second ago we said there's 3 questions, right? Why should this client see me? What do I want the client to do? And how do I add value? So the second question is, what do I want the client to do? You think about this. Before you meet with a customer, you think, what do I want the outcome to be? What you should have is you should have an ideal advance and a couple of alternative advances. Now, if you've never heard that term, let me explain what that means.
Ideal advance, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So a man named Neil Rackham performed the largest sales study ever conducted back in the 80s and involved over 35,000 face-to-face sales interactions.
The spin guy, right?
Spin Selling is the name of his book where you can read about the research.
Okay.
And he coined a couple of phrases and we learned a lot of things about selling from his research. But one of the things he learned is that in complex sales, in 9 out of 10 sales encounters, 9 out of 10 sales encounters don't end with a win or a lose. That's not what happens. What happens in 9 out of 10 sales encounters is you either get an advance. That's the phrase he coined for when the sale moves forward in a little way. Okay. It's a little bit of progress.
Like next step kind of thing.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Right. We either get an advance or we get what he called a continuation. And a continuation is where no progress is made, but the deal doesn't die either. It's just sitting there. Okay. So that's called a continuation. So what happens in 9 out of 10 sales encounters is you either get an advance where the sale moves forward in a little way, or you get a continuation. Okay. That's why you need to prepare a ideal advance. What's the best possible outcome, as well as a couple of alternatives, just in case the ideal advance turns out to be unrealistic for some reason. Right. Okay. Now with that prepared, you're ready to use the perfect close. And there's only 2 questions. There's 0 pressure, completely non-confrontational, and you'll get success around 90 to 95% of the time. Okay.
I'm all ears. Okay.
All right. Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like a miracle, right? So let's tell your audience. So if you got your pen, this is your time to write it down. Okay. The first close question is, does it make sense for us to X? Does it make sense for us to X? Where X is your ideal advance. So if I was asking Ed, I'd say, hey, Ed, does it make sense for us to schedule an assessment for you guys to see what our best options are?
Okay.
Right.
So, and X would be your ideal, right? So like what you wanted, the ideally, what perfect scenario, right?
Right. Okay. Right. So in that example, right, if I said, hey, does it make sense for us to schedule an assessment? The assessment is the X. Okay. Now, there's only 2 things they can say. They're going to say yes, or they're going to say no. If they say yes, awesome. You got your advance and you only had to ask the first question. Mm-hmm. If they say no, then you're just going to use some variation of the second question, which is some variation of, wait for it. Okay, well, what do you think is a good next step then? Yeah, exactly. Right. And so what I can tell you is that after hundreds of ride-alongs, in 90% of cases, the customer will just suggest a very logical next step for where they're at in their buying process. Okay. So that's it. If you just use those 2, you'll end up with either an advance or close each time that you use it. Now, as it turns out, there's actually 5 variations of the perfect close, and that's just the simplest one. That's the kindergarten version. Okay. So we can make it a little bit better by upgrading it with some enhancements. So the first one is called the suggestion. And the thing is in some, like we do a lot of complex B2B sales here. And so the people that buy what we do maybe once in a lifetime. So they're not very good at buying it. So if we can suggest a logical next step first and then ask them if it makes sense to do that. So if we use that same example of an assessment, I might say, hey, Ed, at this stage, a lot of customers will have us do an assessment for them to see what our best options are. Does it make sense for us to schedule an assessment for you guys? Okay. Now, do you see how we're still facilitative? It's still very helpful. It's still 0 pressure. Okay. And we're still throwing the ball to them so they can tell us about the timing of it or not. And by the way, that's an important nuance is the perfect close question. We're not really asking them to do anything. At its core, does it make sense as a timing question? Okay. And that is very different than asking them to actually do something, because regardless of your answer, we haven't actually asked you to do it yet, right? I didn't say, will you do an assessment? If I said that and you said no, our emotional level is going to tank, right? But if I just say, hey, is the timing right for us to do an assessment for you guys? And you say no, you're going to use your curiosity. Well, you'll say, all right, well, what do you think is a good next step then? Must have got that wrong. Now, you can also use the suggestion in the follow-up question. You can say, if they say no to the first one, you can say, oh, sometimes customers at this stage will also do this other thing. Does it make sense for us to do that? And if they say yes, great, you got your advance. If they say no, if you want, you could ask them another fallback question. You can just throw them the ball and say, all right, well, what do you think is a good next step? Okay. Now, that's called the fallback. That whole variation is called the fallback. Another variation that's much more fun is called the add-on. And the add-on is when they say yes to the first thing, you just ask them if they want to do one of the other ones that you prepared, right? So like if I said, hey, does it make sense for us to schedule an assessment? You say yes. We go, great. Sometimes clients at this stage will also do this other thing. Does it make sense for us to do that? If they say yes, then great. We can say, hey, they also sometimes do this third thing. Does it make sense for us to do that? Brilliant. Either going to say yes or no. Regardless, at the end, with the fallback, you throw the ball and you say, hey, what do you think is a good next step? With the add-on, what you say at the end is you say, are there any other logical things we should be thinking about right now? Something like that. And what that does is it gives the customer a chance to suggest something that they might think is logical that you didn't think of. I'll tell you a crazy story that happened to me on this. I'm working with a healthcare organization in Sierra Vista, Arizona, and we were working with their IT people, and we thought we were presenting to the wrong people. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so our ideal advance was to get a demo scheduled with their executive team.
So that's the ideal solution, right?
Yeah. That's what we thought would be the best thing, is to meet with them because we thought they were going to make the decision. Right. So we do our demo and everything. And then I say, well, does it make sense for us to schedule a demo for your executive team so we can get their input and just participation? He goes, yep, that's a great idea. We need everybody involved. I'm like, great. Cha-ching, right? I got my first advance. So I just look at my list. What's the second thing? I say, well, a lot of times clients at this stage will want us to schedule a time for our technical people to talk about the conversion. Does it make sense for us to schedule a time for our technical people to meet? And he goes, yes, my guys are really worried about that. I'm like, hey, wow, cha-ching, I got 2 for 2, right? So then I look at my list and I say, I think we've got everything we need here to create a proposal for you. Does it make sense for us to put together a preliminary proposal just so you can get a feel for the scope of the project? And he goes, yes, that'd be super helpful. I'm like, wow, 3 for 3. Okay. So at the end, just like I was telling you, I say, all right, well, is there anything else we should be thinking about right now? And you'll never believe what this guy says to me. This will blow your mind, right? Is he kind of looks around and he lowers his voice. He goes, well, is there any chance I could get a copy of your standard agreement? Because our legal people can be kind of slow. Right. Wow. And of course, on the outside, I'm like, cool as a cucumber. I'm like, hey, of course, we'd be happy to get you a copy of the agreement. Right. But on the inside, I'm like, yeah, I can't believe it. This guy just asked me for a contract. Right.
Oh, that's still paperwork. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so here's the point of that whole story is obviously this is the funnest, right? Because you just keep piling on advances until you go the rate that the customer's ready to go. And here's the thing is I would have never even dreamed that asking for a contract on the first thing would be realistic, right? But by pacing it the way this guy was ready for, okay, we scored 4 advances, one of which we didn't even think about. Now, imagine if I had made my ideal advance the contract. I don't think that would have come off, right? No. You're like, whoa, what are you doing asking me for a contract right now, right? And so the whole point of either way is for the perfect close, you're pacing it at the rate that the customer is ready to go. It's when we push them faster than they're ready to go. That's when it starts to feel like manipulation to them, right? But with the perfect close, if they want to go slower, then we go slower. If they want to go faster, then we go faster. And so we're just basically matching the pace that they're ready to go.
Wow. So beautiful technique, very natural, right? So nobody's getting pushed and you let the customer to make the choice, right? So like they still feel the power, like they're in control, and they are. Right. So like, and in your case, he even suggested, okay, like would like to get the legal paperwork to take a look at it.
Yep. And here's a rule. Customers are always comfortable with their own suggestions.
Yeah.
Okay. They're always there. So if they're suggesting to do something, they're going to accept it, right? Because they're making the suggestion. So they're always comfortable with that. So again, that's why that second question, well, all right, what do you think is a good next step? It's always going to work. And like I said, very few times will a customer ever come up stumped. But it does happen. So I will just say this. You're going to find success 95% of the time. But if you've suggested 3 logical things to them and they still can't come up with a logical next step, then that tells us something about the quality of the opportunity that we're with and that we need to prioritize it a little bit lower with our time and our energy. Because as salespeople, all we have is our time, right?
Yeah, so you're qualifying them by doing this, right?
Exactly right. And that just tells you, hey, all right, I'm not going to completely ignore this person, but if they can't even come up with a good next step, I'm just going to prioritize them a little lower and work with some of my other opportunities.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing this beautiful technique. A lot of to digest it, guys who are listening. Since this is a storytelling for sales podcast, in your technique, where do you see the fit to include stories in this approach, in this technique?
As a rule, stories are absolutely critical for communication, I would say, right? And that's why rather than just tell you how to do the add-on, I shared a story with you about how to do the add-on because it helps connect the dots better. There's a book that explains why that is. It's called Made to Stick is the name of the book. It's by Chip and Dan Heath.
Oh, it has a little, like a thing on top.
Yeah, duct tape. Yeah, it's an orange book with duct tape on it.
Yeah.
Phenomenal book, right? But the short version of, if you want to say, hey, what's in the book, is that unlike statistics, stories have millions and millions of these memory hooks that are actually tied to emotions. And that makes them much, much more memorable, right? And I'm going to give you an example, okay? So people very often ask me, especially non-salespeople or entrepreneurs that have to sell, they're conflicted about selling. They think that maybe there's something wrong with it, or it's greedy, or that selling is about persuasion or about manipulation. So I'm just going to share a story with you that will illustrate this, and you'll understand both that principle, but as well as how important stories are, right? So rather than just tell people,
okay.
Yeah. So rather than just tell people that selling is serving, okay, what I tell them is I'm in the healthcare space, right? And so I get to see all these different stories that other people don't see. And so years ago, there was a baby that was born. His name was Kaiba Gianfrido. And Kaiba was born with a defective trachea that caused him to stop breathing almost every day after he was about 6 weeks old. His parents were literally doing CPR on him almost every single day.
Wow.
Okay. And it would happen anywhere. It would happen in a grocery store. It happened in a moving car one time. So think about it. Can you imagine as a parent what that would be like? Do you think they got any sleep at all, knowing that at any minute your kid might just stop breathing and die? Right. And then poor Kaiba, right, can't breathe. So the whole story is just tragic. And they saw a ton of doctors, but because it was a birth defect, they just didn't have any answers. They said, well, one of these times they're just not going to catch it, and the Kaiba's not going to make it. Eventually, they got to a doctor named Dr. Glenn Green at University of Michigan C.S. Mott's Children's Hospital. And what Dr. Green had done is he had developed this biodegradable 3D printed medical splint that might be able to be applied to Kaiba's trachea and maybe save his life. But he couldn't do it because it hadn't been FDA approved. It had never been done on a patient ever. Mm-hmm. And you got to see this thing. It's just a little tiny, it's like the size of the top of a pencil. It's very small, right? And so Dr. Green went to some extensive effort to get the FDA to approve trying to use this procedure to maybe save Kaiba's life, right? And fortunately, the FDA approved it. So for the very first time, they did this procedure, not on an adult, but on an infant, okay? And fortunately, that procedure was a success. That little 3D printed biodegradable medical splint saved Kaiba's life. I have pictures of this, and it's a wonderful story to share with folks, right? Now, here's the funny thing. You tell people, they say, that's wonderful. When we see the efforts that someone like Dr. Green went to, we say, it's great to see society. I'm part of that. If I had the ability to save a life that way, we would all do it, right? Yeah. Without hesitation. And so then I like to share, did you know, Ed, that there's a sale in there? There's a sale in that.
In this story?
Yes, there's a sale.
I did not notice that it was very emotional.
Well, the biodegradable materials to print with, the CT scans, the MRI scans, none of that had been on a reimbursement schedule ever before. The guy that actually made that sale is named Scott Hollister. That's the guy who sold that. Okay. Mm-hmm. He's the one that made it possible because all of that stuff wouldn't have been able to be reimbursed or paid for. Right. And so I got to tell you, in healthcare, there's thousands of stories just like this. Okay. And I like to say, all right, let me ask you a question. Is anybody sad that a sale was made here?
No.
Right? Well, of course not. We're happy that a sale was made, right? It saved a child's life, right? It saved Kaiba's life. And then I ask another question. Now, why is it that we see that sale different than other kinds of sales? Mm-hmm. Why is that? And the answer is that we can connect the dots. We can see how that selling effort directly affected the well-being and livelihood of another human being, another person, right? At its core, those dramatic stories help us see what selling truly is, and that's serving. Yeah. Selling is an act of service. And so we shouldn't cause us to hesitate at all. Just like the same way we would happily help someone across the street, that's the same thing when we're selling. We're helping another person. Every solution that we have, regardless of what you sell, helps a person achieve a goal, fulfill a dream, or avert a crisis. One of those three things, right? Yeah. And those are all very noble things. So when we help our clients, we and our clients are enriched in a virtuous cycle, and there should be no hesitation in that. In fact, it should be motivating in its own right. So that's a story that I use to help shift people's paradigm about what selling really is. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, I could just have told you, which I did actually at the beginning of that story, I could just say, hey, selling is serving, but it does not connect with the
not
human
like that. Not
like their core nature, unless I explain this other story that says, look, why is that sale different? And it's like, yeah, you're right. Even though I sell tires, what I'm doing is I'm helping another person be able to get to their work and maybe get to this thing that they're going to do with their family. You're improving their lives in some way. And so when we see it that way, then literally the selling part becomes intrinsically motivating because you're actually trying to help and to serve another person, right? But that illustrates 2 points, which is selling that is serving, but also illustrates why it's more important to use a story to explain and illustrate those principles than it is say it.
Beautiful. I love it. There's so much you compacted there. And again, sales became such a bad word. But if you look at this through the angle you just described, like through the stories of actually helping people, that's a whole new mindset. And that affects everything. This is the intention statement, right? So like I do this because I help people and I help them authentically.
Yep, exactly right.
So great interview. So really appreciate it. One last question before we go. As a sales leader, as a leader of 2 organizations, what kind of challenges do you see in the current days? Is there anything you particularly see what needs to be addressed from a sales leadership perspective?
There's lots of them. I would say probably the biggest, and I think this applies to everybody, is just distraction. Yeah. There's just way too many distractions out there, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that really is an important challenge is dealing with that. That means telling people when they can talk to you and when they can't talk to you. It means focusing. It means prioritizing. That's probably the biggest challenge. And I would say probably the second biggest challenge, especially for some guy that's basically got 3 jobs, is you need to try to get your work-life balance. There was a time in my life when I was working so hard, I was neglecting my family, and that's going to end in a very bad place. And so I'd say for pretty much any executive is you got to make sure that you're not working so much that you're compromising your family life, right? We work so we can live. We don't live so we can work.
Beautiful. Again, thank you so much. So there's so much compacted for our listeners. They will appreciate. What's the best way to connect with you, learn about your book? How do they find you?
Sure. Probably the best way is to go to my website, which is puremuir.com. It's puremuir.com. Pure rhymes with Muir, which is why I did that, because people have a hard time pronouncing my last name.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that's right. And if you go there, you can actually download, we only talked about a few of the models, but you can actually for free, you can download all the models of the perfect close, the first 3 chapters of the book. There's a whole bundle there. I used to have like 20 different downloads, and I just combined them all into one file where you download that and you get everything. And so there's about a dozen different resources there, including a special report on myths of closing and all of that. But that's probably the best thing, is to subscribe there. But I'm certainly active on LinkedIn. So if you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to connect with you there. And I'm active on Twitter. And so that's a perfectly okay place for us to connect as well. All those are fine.
Great. So we'll make sure we include those links. And I did do this download. Guys, it's great. There's so much resources there. It does work. Really encourage you.
All right. Good to hear. Technology is working.
Technology is working. So thank you so much, James. We really appreciate your wisdom. So perfect close and how we survive and actually thrive in the virtual world with perfect close. So thank you so much again, James.
Thanks for having me on, Ed. It's great.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye for now.
That does it for this episode of Storytelling for Sales. You'll find show notes and links on our webpage, storytellingsales.com. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.